Before this seminar, we've had 6 previous events, each centered on the 80th anniversary of a significant battle or campaign of the Second World War. Our inaugural event discussed the Marianas Island campaign from June to July of 1944, and focused on drawing parallels between it and the current strategic military buildup taking place in the first and second island chains to counter China, and the lasting legacy of the campaign as a symbol of sacrifice and a turning point in World War II. Our second event covered the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944, applicable to today's circumstances because of its lessons regarding joint military operations, adaptability, and decisive leadership, as well as its historical importance as the largest naval battle in history and the turning point that secured the Allied dominance in the Pacific. The third JPI event, discussing the liberation of Luzon and Manila in early 1945, reinforced the need for productive alliance building and readiness for future threats, as well as the importance of being consistent with our rhetoric and actions with existing allies through MacArthur's quote, "I shall return," a famous promise made in March of 1942 after MacArthur was ordered to leave the Philippines. The fourth panel discussion on the firebombing of Tokyo highlighted the importance of following international law and post-war accountability, as shown by the quote, "If we lose, we'd all be tried as war criminals," from General Curtis LeMay, who carried out and designed the systematic strategic firebombing campaign in the Pacific Theater during World War II, including, of course, the firebombing of Tokyo. The fifth panel discussion covered the deadly Battle of Okinawa, which resulted in massive casualties on all sides. The discussion also served as a stark reminder of the heavy costs of modern warfare, both for combatants and civilians, and influences contemporary strategic planning for conflicts such as a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan. The most recent JPI panel discussion, the sixth JPI event, covered the use of atomic weapons on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As the only instance of such weapons being used against the human population, panelists discussed the effects of nuclear devastation and the ethics of the decision to employ such weapons against a primarily non-military target. They discussed the precedent set for justifiable methods to use in a war, especially given the potentially greater human cost of a full-scale invasion.
The Journey to Peace initiative was founded almost 2 years ago, aiming to inspire peace through panel discussions by connecting young leaders in the Asia-Pacific region with each other and educating them on historical lessons so they may better handle present-day challenges and hopefully send the world further down the global journey to peace. We're very fortunate today to have 2 wonderful moderators. First, Karen Knudsen, Chair of the Japan-American Society of Hawaii, Adjunct Senior Fellow at the East-West Center, and former Chair of the Hawaii State Board of Education. In her service as an elected member of the Hawaii State Board of Education, Karen has spent 20 years setting statewide education policy for Hawaii's K-12 schools. She also serves on the American Red Cross Pacific Islands Region Board of Directors. The panel will also be moderated by Lila Berg, who has served in Hawaii's public schools as a teacher, principal, and University of Hawaii instructor. She is a former Hawaii state legislator and founder of Kids Voting Hawaii. Dr. Berg is also the former host of Olelo Community Media's Island Focus and owner/principal consultant of Lila Berg and Associates, an international company focusing on leadership development. Moreover, she is an executive board member of the National Council for Learning and Civic Engagement. And I will be giving the mic to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rowan and Gordon. Excellent presentation. Thank you for the introduction. And I'd like to really thank all of the supporting organizations who have made all this series possible, and especially to those of you who have shown up today. It's kind of messy outside, but it's also beautiful in Hawaii, but thank you for taking the time to join us. Today, as co-moderators, Lila and I will serve as the 2 bookends, holding the program together and focused, and our panelists are the content, sharing their deep knowledge and expertise. Lila?
Thank you, Karen. Before we begin, it's my responsibility to give a quick disclaimer. JPI is an unincorporated group of individuals, and today's session will contain factual information, but personal views expressed are those of the individuals and not of the organization. Following the formal discussion with the panelists, we'll open the program for questions from the audience. So please be thinking about something that one of our panelists have said so that we can call upon you for the questions.
Thank you, Lila. Do we have Frank online? I'm sorry, Richard Frank. I'm going to be introducing him, and hopefully he does appear. Okay, sorry, thank you. Richard Frank is a lawyer and historian who is internationally recognized as an expert on World War II in the Pacific. Upon graduating from the University of Missouri, he served a tour of duty in Vietnam with the 101st Airborne Division. A prolific author, Rich has written numerous articles and books, including Downfall, The End of the Imperial Japanese Empire, Why Truman Dropped the Bomb, and Tower of Skulls, A History of the Asia-Pacific War, among many others. Next, and also I wanted to introduce and thank Clementine for presenting us with Lay. John Hanson, to my left, is a retired Army colonel who, among other duties, served as Director of Army Air Force Development in Afghanistan, where he trained and flew with the Afghan National Army air crews during Operation Enduring Freedom. He's a principal analyst supporting Indo-PACOM and an adjunct professor of political science at HPU. John is a coordinating member of the Journey to Peace initiative. Next, Dan Leaf is a retired U.S. Air Force Lieutenant General who is widely known by his fighter pilot moniker, FIG. He is a decorated combat fighter pilot, the former director of the Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies. FIG is the managing director of Phase -1 LLC, providing consulting services focused on peace on the Korean Peninsula, conflict resolution, and strategic leadership. He also serves as the Honorary Consul General for Vietnam in Hawaii. Honorary Consul for Vietnam in Hawaii. Jim Moriarty is a former U.S. Ambassador to Nepal and Bangladesh. He has also served as Senior Director for Asia and the National Security Council, and at the National Security Council, and as head of the political sections of the U.S. Embassy in Beijing and at the American Institute in Taiwan. In total, he spent 10 years in either Beijing or Taipei. He's a former chairman of the American Institute in Taiwan and a consultant with Indo-PACOM. I have a personal plug for Jim and his wife, Lauren Moriarty. They are both served as the only tandem diplomats in residence at the East-West Center. So we're very proud of that. Thank you. John, if you'll tee up today's program discussion, briefly touching on war, human nature, and escalation, including an overview of the conditions in the region and the war's end, specifically focusing on Japan.
I certainly will. Thank you, Karen. And again, to echo all the welcomes and thank yous for the participants here today, particularly those that have endured this now, the series. This is number 7. So if this is your 7th time, thank you, especially for that. I do want to point out and thanks specifically Rich Frank for being on the line, sir. Thank you for taking a Saturday evening, which is where you are now, and being part of this. Rich, you may be interested to know that the Aviation Brigade up at the 25th Infantry Division is literally about 50 feet away from us doing a field training problem with Chinooks, Blackhawks, etc. So if you were here, I'm sure it would have brought back fond memories from your days in the 101st Airborne Division. I do want to also again underscore the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum. Have been just a fantastic hosts. And Chris Moylan and I had a chance to meet the new executive director, a guy named John Hiltz, Blue Angel pilot and retired Air Force or Navy, obviously. His airplane, by the way, is right outside the door here with the shameless John Hiltz written right below the canopy. But he is really stoked about this program, and he's leaning forward to be helpful as we go forward with the Journey to Peace initiative in its next steps. So that's really, really good news for us. And the last thing I would say to all the veterans here, happy Veterans Day. This is your weekend. Thank you for your service, and enjoy a well-earned respite as veterans. So the committee asked me to do a little bit of a warm-up. to this session, and I got to tell you, this session number 7 is probably the most important session if you look at our mission. This is post-conflict. How do we really get down and dirty with the journey to secure and enable the peace? The first 6 sessions, as Rowan and Gordon just described, looked at what is inarguably a global disaster, global man-made disaster. If you took, the Second World War in context, that's really what it was. Session 7 now is going to be, how do we turn that into a global man-made or a global disaster response? Just to put it in context, imagine 4 to 9 years of level 5 hurricanes, earthquakes, everything that could devastate civil society is what was the result, the physical result, to include countless deaths. So that's where we are in this discussion. 80 years ago, we began the global disaster response. And so, what would it be? We'll discuss that tonight. What would it really shape out to be? Would it be like after World War I, where we punished the civil populations of the losers? Or would it be something different, where the civilian populations were not punished? But there would be justice for those that kind of brought the disaster upon humanity. So this slide kind of encompasses where we are. You can see, interestingly, by this time 80 years ago, are we showing that? Jasmine, I've already become a no-go at this station. Yeah, so there we go, thank you. You might have to advance them for me. So by this time, the Japanese Navy and Air Force really are decisively defeated. The Army, however, is out there in huge numbers. And so that's an interesting challenge. And of course, as we discussed last time, the Japanese civilian society is devastated. And so that's kind of the picture where we are. So this map kind of shows, the footprint of the Army, especially in various stages of readiness, fairly low mostly, but still out there in large numbers. And so, as we discussed last time, the atomic weapons shocked not only Japan, but the world. Now we had to surrender on 2 September. Now it's time to get at demobilizing and disarming Imperial Japanese forces. And they officially agreed to sign to surrender on the 2nd. Famine and disease was the plight of the Japanese people at this point. Anger and retribution for the Japanese for crimes against humanity awaited a new application of justice. And peaceful acceptance of an occupation force on the main islands of Japan was not particularly certain at this point. This next slide talks about, if we could, some of the conditions set for the occupation. So in Potsdam, Germany, which is now devastated and defeated, the world leaders get together to decide what's next with Japan. So the interesting thing about this picture on the left is you don't see Franklin Roosevelt. You don't see Winston Churchill, both of whom are out of the picture. Unfortunately, Roosevelt passes away, and Churchill loses an election in the UK. So this new team of deciders decides on unconditional surrender, etc. The picture on the right shows an interesting thing about unconditional surrender we can talk about tonight, where you have General MacArthur and the Emperor Hirohito in the same space. And there's a whole story about that we'll talk about. I think that's, okay, one more warm-up here. So what is the occupation? The occupation is led by the U.S. As decided in Potsdam. General MacArthur would lead it as the supreme commander. It would be in 3 phases, and it would begin in 1945 and not end until the force leaves 7 years later. So we'll discuss some of that as well tonight. The forces in Japan arrive, all services, Army, Navy, Air Force, newly minted Air Force and Marines, on the Japanese soil. We have a unique opportunity tonight to hear from the daughter of one of those then second lieutenants that arrived in Japan, to run into another relative who was in the Navy, also there. And so without any further ado, I'd like to give the mic over to Ambassador Lauren Moriarty, and just a little bit of background. You know, Lauren's a 30-year Foreign Service officer, several years at ambassador levels. She is an institution here in Hawaii on the Board of Education. She was a dean at APC, Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. She's a trustee in several vocations. And the most important thing is that we met each other about 15 years ago in Dhaka, Bangladesh, when her and her husband, the gentleman sitting right next to me, were chief of mission team there. So, with any further ado, Lauren, would you discuss your unique family relationship here with this subject tonight?
Thank you, John, for that warm introduction as well. And if I could get some help advancing the slide, we've got a picture of my family members there. So, aloha mai kako, everybody. What? Another, oh, thank you. How's that? Step aside a little more. Okay. So, from Pearl Harbor through the. Ooh. Okay, let's try that. How's that? Better? Okay. So from Pearl Harbor, right through the battles that have been described, to the surrender and the occupation and beyond, what happened in World War II in the Pacific touched us here in Hawaii. So, let's see, we've got a couple pictures here. This picture on this side over here is my dad, David Peters. I've got some other family members here, my sister Di, my brother Kevin, grandson of David, David Wynn, granddaughters here, and a sister-in-law. So Peter's family extended is in force. That's my dad. He was a Maui boy. He was raised on Maui, boarded at the Kamehameha School for Boys on Oahu for intermediate school, and returned to graduate from Maui High School in 1941. He was the first person appointed to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point from the island of Maui. Dad graduated from West Point in 1946, and as a young officer was, as John said, assigned to the occupation in Japan. His job there, we just talked about the devastation in Japan. And the soldiers that Dad was commanding had been conditioned to think of the Japanese as their enemies. Dad's job was to help those same soldiers deliver humanitarian aid to help relieve the suffering of the Japanese people. I remember sometimes when we were growing up, Dad on the phone, "Mushi mushi, mushi mushi," and he would like to sing, what was it? Oh, my brain goes, "Shina no yoru." But what I really remember is when Dad talked about being in Japan, what he usually talked about was the suffering of the Japanese people and how sad it made him feel. Dad had another close relative who was there at the same time as him in the occupation. And Uncle worked with the U.S. Army Medical Corps, helping to take care of the survivors of the atomic bombs that we had dropped. Our uncle was so touched by what he saw during this time that he later went back to Japan and adopted an orphan Japanese boy. Another local person who was during the occupation in Japan was George Ariyoshi, who later became governor of the state of Hawaii. He served as an interpreter with U.S. Military Intelligence Service in Japan. He used to tell a story about the first Japanese boy he met, a young 7-year-old Chinese shoeshine boy, and how that boy did that work because he'd seen the suffering of his family and felt that he needed to do whatever he could to help to ease their suffering. And he, Governor Ariyoshi, saw that as an example of Japan's enduring spirit that transcended this terrible period. The other picture there is of my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, Vice Admiral Lorenzo Sherwood Sabin, Jr. So Gramps was assigned to a ship in Pearl Harbor when the Japanese attacked on December 7, 1941. He commanded the close naval gunnery support and the assault convoy for the D-Day landings at Omaha Beach in Norway. He was aboard, say again? Normandy, sorry, not Norway. Normandy. He was aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay for the surrender of the Japanese and served during the occupation. Later, he helped to evacuate civilians from Vietnam when that country was split in two, and back to Taiwan when the Japanese shelled the offshore islands of Taiwan. When Gramps thought long and spoke and wrote often about the aftermath of war. In 1957, he told a reporter, "The American is basically a very humane character. He'll always sacrifice for those less fortunate." In a 1948 letter to his daughters, Gramps wrote about the aftermath of war and how it leaves destruction, desolation, and despair in the defeated countries. Unrest, economic stability, and confusion affect the victorious as well as the vanquished nations. He wrote to his daughters about what our country and citizens can do and must do in conditions like these. So Dad married the Admiral's daughter in Japan in 1953. Dad went on to serve a distinguished 30-year career in the U.S. Army as an infantry officer. He then served the people of Hawaii for another 3 decades as executive assistant to U.S. Senator Daniel K. Inouye, trustee of the Queen Liliuokalani Trust, and an active community member. Dad was dedicated to duty, which he defined in a 2008 speech as the responsibility that each of us has to use whatever intelligence and skills and strength we have to accomplish some good purpose. Dad lived by Queen Liliuokalani's motto, Onipa'a, be steadfast, persevere until you achieve your mission. He was passionate about education and delighted to help people be all they could be. He really got that Army motto. I want to end with one last story. Sure. Okay. I want to end with one last very short story. One of Dad's classmates from Maui High in 1941 was Nobuaki Iwatake. After graduation, he went to see his family in Japan and was conscripted into the Japanese Army and forced to fight against the United States, his country of birth. After the war, Dad and he renewed their friendship and corresponded for many years, and he eventually was able to come here and visit and renew his ties with his Maui high school classmates. He also, though, a Maui boy, contributed to peace in another way. He served as the primary U.S. interpreter at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo for decades. So we end up right where we started, back on Maui. Thank you very much for listening to these stories, and I look forward to a wonderful panel discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lauren. Those were touching. And to know that the experiences that your family and Governor Ariyoshi had went on to influence them, their future contributions to the state of Hawaii and to U.S.-Japan relations. I appreciate that. Before we get on to the more serious part of the discussion, I just have a couple of personal things. I think I was on that trip with you to Dhaka. I know I had dinner with Lauren and Jim, 2009 actually, but my second trip to Dhaka was with you 15 years ago. And also, I think we're pleased to have 3 former members of the Hawaii State Board of Education with Lauren, myself, and Lila. So you're amongst educators. Or people you can blame for any problems you have. So anyway, Lila, over to you.
Thank you, Karen. Moving right along. You know, one of the things that has struck me being involved in this Journeys to Peace effort and initiative is not just the facts and the information and the vision and the encouragement that all of these folks have, but it's also the relationships, and I'm hoping you'll keep that in mind. And Rich, thank you for joining us wherever you are. And I'm going to address the first question to you. So we're going to be discussing occupation, justice, and a better state of peace. From Lauren's story, devastation and the specter of famine and pestilence and disaster really seemed a certain future for the people of Japan. Could you describe the occupation and what was the overall plan? You know, what were we have a sense of the general conditions, but if you could share with us your perspective, we'd appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm having great difficulty hearing your end of it.
So the question really has to do with occupation.
Okay.
What was the overall plan after the war?
I heard you say, what was the overall
Plan for occupation.
Oh, well,
Yes.
okay. Well, let me emphasize that what I've been doing in terms of this trilogy I'm writing about the Asia-Pacific War is talking not only about the military components, but also the effects of the war on civilian populations. And one of the most remarkable stories I came across in the course of that concerns elements of the American occupation of Japan that, in my view, have never been properly given fair attention. There are 2 parts to this. The first of which involves a gentleman named Crawford Sams, who was a colonel, later a brigadier general, who headed up the medical component of the occupation under Douglas MacArthur. Sams had never worked with MacArthur directly before until he got to Japan. When he got to Japan, he headed up a command that actually only had about 150 people in it, almost all Americans and a few Japanese. And when he arrived in Japan, he confronted a situation in which he recognized there was a great potential for disastrous diseases. We had promised the Japanese people that we would have repatriation from overseas of those Japanese who were overseas, and there were about 6 million of them, split almost evenly between military and civilians. And they were going to be returning to Japan. At the same time, a large group of other Asians who maybe had been held as slave laborers in Japan were supposed to be repatriated back to their home countries. This was a perfect recipe for deadly diseases being spread, and in fact, as soon as the process started, Sams recognized that that was exactly what was going to happen. There was typhus, there was cholera, and Sam sprang into action. The first thing he did was he mobilized the Japanese medical establishment by freeing it from its complete control by the Japanese militarists to provide basically a manpower to be able to meet these challenges. He personally went to a lot of these places where these epidemics were breaking out to direct the operations. Later, Sams would extend his role to basically public health throughout Japan. And what he managed to do during that time was he reduced the annualized death rate in Japan, which in 1940, which was before the war broke out with the U.S., was running at a rate of 18.7 deaths per 1,000 people per year. And by the time he finished with his occupation reforms of the Japanese health system by 1952, the Japanese annualized death rate, based on that same metric, was 8.1 deaths per 1,000 per year. In other words, the annualized death rate in Japan was halved during Crawford Sam's supervision of medical operations and medical situation in Japan between 1945 and 1952. The leading Japanese historian, first-generation historian of the occupation of Japan, Eiichi Takame, said that he believed that Sam's efforts altogether saved probably about 3 million Japanese lives. Now, the total number of Japanese who died in the Asia-Pacific War, as far as I can calculate, it's about 2 million military personnel and about 1 to 1.2 million civilians. So in other words, Crawford Sam's efforts by themselves saved almost the same number of Japanese lives as were lost in the entire Asia-Pacific War. And this was by far the lesser of the two American efforts during the occupation of Japan that resulted in the saving of enormous numbers of Japanese lives. And this second effort involved Douglas MacArthur. And what I've spent a lot of time with Douglas MacArthur. It's not been a trouble-free experience, to say the least. But when I came across this story, which I got inklings of when I went looking for something else, and then I was at the MacArthur Archive and began searching for documentation of what had actually happened. And the story, in a very abbreviated form, goes like this. When the occupation began, MacArthur was under orders that the Japanese government would be responsible for feeding the Japanese people. And he was given explicit instructions that there would be, as the directive indicated, no, quote, gratuitous, unquote, issuance of U.S. food to the Japanese. Well, when the occupation began, almost immediately Japanese officials came to MacArthur and other members of his staff and began reporting that the Japanese rice crop in 1945 had collapsed. And at first, MacArthur and his staff were skeptical about this. However, as they gathered more and more information, by October they realized that there was very great substance in what the Japanese were reporting. By November, they had the reports about what the 1945 rice crop had been, because the Japanese operated on what was called a rice year, from the 1st of November to the 31st of October the following year. The rice harvest was gathered in September and October, and basically by the end of that gathering, you knew what you had for the year that was going to extend until the following October. And basically the rice crop in 1945 had collapsed to 6.4 million metric tons. The prior year it had been 10 million metric tons. And by December 1945, MacArthur and the leaders of the occupation had become convinced that in fact the Japanese were correct, that if you simply did the math, if you took the number of how much rice there was available, the number of Japanese population that had to be fed, and the number of days that had to be done, the math showed that the Japanese would be in famine conditions in mid-1946. And MacArthur decided that the only way that this could be headed off would be the shipment of large amounts of U.S. food, which he also recognized was not going to be a popular activity in the U.S. in 1945, 1946. And MacArthur began his campaign in January 1946 with what I would call the Just the Facts report that he sent to Washington, simply describing what the rice crop was, how many Japanese had to be fed, how long it would take for the Japanese to be fed during 1946, with the obvious point that by mid-1946 there was going to be mass starvation in Japan. And he got nowhere with his initial sort of Just the Facts reporting. And this being Douglas MacArthur, of course, once he realized that he was not going to get anywhere with Just the Facts, he went to Plan B, which was characterized by one historian as scared the hell out of him. And basically he began describing in dire but not inaccurate terms just exactly how bad things were going to be. That they were going to be out of food to feed the Japanese populace in mid-1946. Now, I have to qualify that by saying that what he recognized and what the occupation authorities recognized was that it was going to be the urban population in Japan. It was going to be in dire straits. The rural population, the food growers, they were going to feed themselves. They were not an issue in terms of mass death from starvation. It was the urban population that was critical at this point. Now, in the fall of 1944, before the bombing really got going, and of course before the rice crop in 45 collapsed, the Japanese population in Japan itself was just a little over 70 million. Of that 70 million, about 44 million at that moment lived in urban areas. And this particularly was on Honshu. If you drew a line across Honshu just north of the Tokyo urban area, from that point to the south and west, as we would count it, this was a great food deficit area. It had the great majority of Japanese who basically were dependent upon having food shipped from other places in Japan to that area and imported food. And these people were not going to have food. Now, due to the bombing and to the failure of the 1945 rice crop, there was a mass exodus from Japanese cities to rural areas trying to seek salvation. MacArthur continued to pursue persuading Washington that we were going to send massive amounts of American food. And he finally got to the point where basically he was telling Washington that the situation, if the Japanese plunged into a famine in mid-1946, would not be controllable by the occupation forces that he had available. Those occupation forces had dramatically been reduced due to the great drawdown of American forces immediately after World War II. And he said in several messages, send me troops or send me food, one or the other. And finally, he sent a message directly saying, with the sort of effrontery that only MacArthur was capable of, that basically he wanted the record to be made clear that it had been given to President Truman himself, that he knew from MacArthur's reports that Japanese were going to be in mass famine in mid-1946 if we didn't send food. And to his great credit, Harry Truman in May 1946 finally recognized that what MacArthur said and was claiming was true, and he authorized the shipment of massive amounts of U.S. food to Japan. The net total that we sent to Japan in July 1946, we were sending 18 million tons of U.S. food to Japan in July 1946, 20 million tons of U.S. food to Japan in August 1946, and 15 million tons of U.S. food to Japan in September 1946. That food essentially went to feed the urban populations that were basically in food deficit areas in Japan. It included the feeding of the entire population of Tokyo in July and August 1946, which numbered 2.5 million people. They were entirely dependent upon U.S. food for survival in July and August 1946. Now, the summary report that was prepared by MacArthur's headquarters at the end of this period said that they estimated that sending U.S. food had saved 11 million Japanese from starvation. Now, they didn't directly say saved 11 million Japanese from starving to death. I've gone through the records, and basically I believe that it's quite clear that at a minimum, the number of Japanese lives that were saved by shipping U.S. food to Japan in mid-1946 was easily 3 million and possibly 6 million or possibly even more. There are reports going up to 10 million lives were saved. And once again, this was the urban population of Japan that was remaining in the cities in these food deficit areas in 1946. So in total, what we did in 1945-46, the medical effort by Crawford Sams is estimated to have saved 3 million Japanese lives, which is just about equal to the total number of Japanese who died during the Asia-Pacific War, both the military and the civilians. And then the food shipments to Japan in 1946, heading off the famine, saved easily probably another 3 million to 6 million Japanese lives. So we saved between 2 and 3 times as many Japanese lives with our food aid and our medical efforts from 1946 onward in Japan as were lost in the entire Asia-Pacific War. Why this story has not been known prior to this time, that's an element of this I'm still working on, because I'm totally baffled by why we didn't really fully comprehend this earlier. So that's the main thrust of what I have to say.
Oh, thank you, Rich. That was impactful a lot. I mean, I was totally unaware of most of what you just said, so thank you. And just, you might already know as well that Hawaii, and here people know that we sent a lot of pigs to Okinawa. It was very much appreciated by the Okinawans following the war. So, would anyone on the panel like to add or comment to this? Okay, it might come up in questions if you have anything else, but thank you so much. I'd like next to go to Fig, and each of the panelists can weigh in on this, but Fig to take the lead on justice.
Thanks, Karen. Thank you all for being here and for the whole initiative that I've been pleased to be a part of for some time. I need to start the discussion of justice with kind of my overall assessment of the post-war reconciliation with Japan, just to set the framework. And I do a lot of work in peace and post-conflict reconciliation. One thing I think I've learned is that to get through truth and reconciliation, the core of peacemaking, you have to have just enough truth to allow for reconciliation. And between the United States and Japan, we did that, but not so much more broadly. So if I were to characterize the reconciliation, I'd say it was a bilateral success and a global failure. And I think Jim will talk about some of the reasons for that. Before I talk specifically about the process of post-war justice, I'll say there are other factors. One of them, already alluded to, is the shock of the atomic attacks on Japan, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those were stunning events. We're still stunned by it today, every August. Not just on the 80th anniversary, but every August we think about it and reflect on it and are stunned by the instantaneous loss of somewhere around 200,000 lives. Not to mention the additional 100,000 killed in the Tokyo firebombing. And I think that colored the U.S. approach to Japan. A bit of guilt, perhaps, or regret that it was necessary if it wasn't guilt. I think the nation was also war-weary to the max extent possible. But I also think that in the case of Japan, and I'm going to differentiate between Imperial Japan and modern Japan. In the case of the atrocities committed by Imperial Japan, and there were many, unlike in Europe, we lacked faces and spaces. So in Europe, we had faces of those released from the concentration camps and of the dead in the concentration camps. So we had spaces to remember that and to internalize that. I've been to Dachau. I'm sure some of you, the others here have been to a concentration camp. That is something that will never leave you. We have the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. I've been to the Holocaust Museum equivalent in Nanjing, but that isn't something that the United States internalizes. We don't think a lot about the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign of retribution. We have a representative of the Doolittle raid aircraft just a few meters over this way, that after the Chinese helped the Doolittle raiders who crash landed in China, the Imperial Japanese waged a campaign that cost around 300,000 Chinese lives. Add that to the 300,000 in broader Nanjing, it's at least as tragic, but it's not visible. We don't see it like we see Hiroshima or Dachau or the Holocaust Museum. So it wasn't viewed the same, I think, by the Americans. There's another absence of faces. So many of the Japanese soldiers who waged that war in the way that Imperial Japan waged it fought to the death and didn't come home and share their scars. So it's different. Those are all alongside what I'll say about the Justice Campaign. In both theaters of war, there were international military tribunals. And if you look at the surface, they're nearly identical in composition, construct, and content. But they were not at all identical in outcome. And just if there's one thing I'd leave with you, is that at no point was Imperial Japan and the citizens of Japan assigned collective responsibility for the atrocities of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy. And that let them off the hook. There's a good side to that. It let them rebuild Japan very rapidly and help the country become one of our most important allies in the world. But that absence of collective assignation of guilt leaves scars elsewhere, especially China, but also Korea. I was in China in September, in northeast China, and was taken to by my Chinese hosts. I travel there regularly and for a variety of reasons. I was taken to the 80th anniversary of the end of the anti-Japan War, not World War II. And then I went to Dandong, Chongqing, and Shenyang, formerly Mukden, where I got to go to 3 museums about the anti-Japan War and about the Japanese occupation of China. They're not done yet. So bilaterally, we had a justice system that, or a justice construct that solved things for the U.S. and Japan, but globally we didn't. And why is that? To get to some specifics. As I said, the tribunal in Europe and the tribunal in Japan were nearly identical. Both had international composition. The matters that they looked at were nearly the same, and the international component extended beyond each main tribunal. The zonal powers in the divided up former Nazi Germany had their own tribunals, and there were a cascading series of investigations and trials. Same thing happened in Japan. And in fact, if you look at the punishments, you would say that Japan was treated more harshly, interestingly, but not collectively. A key element of the differentiation is in Germany, the successor to Adolf Hitler, Admiral Donitz, was in fact tried. In Japan, Emperor Hirohito was not just not tried, he was not called as a witness at the tribunal, and in fact, at MacArthur's insistence, he was rebranded. And this is not animus towards Emperor Hirohito or anything else, it's just a fact. There is ample documentation of his wartime role, his constitutional powers, and the fact that you could easily have called him before the court. He wasn't, because MacArthur thought he was so important to the stability of Japan, and we talked about if they hadn't had food, crowd control would have been an issue. Well, imagine if they deposed and perhaps jailed and executed the emperor. So it was not an illegitimate consideration, but that was part of the lack of collective blame. Secondly, in both theaters, crimes against humanity were to be considered. They were in Europe, and this is an important distinction in law and in spirit. In Europe, they were considered, tried, and elements of convictions. They were expressly and intentionally omitted by the U.S. authorities that ran the tribunal in Japan. And I think that gets me to a very important main point. It may have been international in name, and there were international members of the court. This was a U.S. dealio. The United States ran it, dictated who, what, when, and how happened in the Far East Tribunal. And we did it in our own interest. There is a surprise. The country acted in its own interest. And again, I'm not indicting anybody post-mortem, I'm just saying that's what happened. So certainly it allowed us to create the relationship we have between modern Japan and the United States, but again, that lack of collective responsibility led to a bit of denial inside Japan and a lot of resentment that remains today outside of Japan. A couple of other quick points about collective responsibility. Organizations were not deemed criminal as war criminals in Japan. They were in Germany, Gestapo, SS, and other elements. But in Japan, the Kempeitai, the military police, and other special services, including Unit 731, the Biological Human Experience Unit, were not labeled as criminal organizations. It's individual, not collective, an important distinction. In Germany, the industrials who fueled the Nazi war machine were, in some cases, tried and generally disenfranchised. In Japan, the industrial base was mobilized and forgiven. Okay? All of that led to where we are today, where I have to go to doggone anti-Japan war museum in Beijing, but it's not about me, it's about what do we do to improve the standing and influence of modern Japan in the modern world in the name of peace and stability. And I think that for both the United States and Japan, it's worth an effort to get enough more truth to get broader reconciliation.
Thank you, Fig, and that really sets the stage for the last phase of this conversation. You know, the author and political scientist Joe Nye suggests that a combination of power and interdependence is a way to peaceful international relations. As we were hearing from Fig, the world was angered and seeking retribution for crimes against humanity, and they were awaiting whatever this justice would look like. The political scientists also theorize that international relations can set conditions for countries to seek collaboration and cooperation to achieve those interests. Can you enlighten us a little bit and encourage us and speak to what is the better state of the peace that we're looking for in the world?
Hello, thank you. I'm going to start off by stating, no, we did not achieve a better peace in Asia in particular. I'm going to stick to that right now, and then I'm going to branch out from there. As they say always when they raise a point like that, I will say it was complicated. You had this massive lust for retribution. I think what I heard yesterday that something like a third of the people in the United States surveyed recommended that we just wipe out the Japanese population. Think about that. Why? 4 years of bloody war that was forced upon us unwillingly, that we had no real feeling was going to be coming. And then what happened? You know, we talked in previous iterations about the firebombing, about the atomic weapons, and then we sent folks like my father-in-law to be part of an occupation of a totally defeated power, a power that we actually had a lingering respect for. Industrious people who had made huge advances in 50 years. And what did we get? I would argue that we did get a more just peace in Japan than we had any reason to expect. Because of people like Mr. Sams, or maybe he was a Dr. Sams, the efforts we made of MacArthur bringing in food to prevent starvation, the decision, conscious decision, to encourage the revitalization of the Japanese economy. All those were very good things. Japan's traditions also went in the right direction. They were used to the concept of democracy, even if they had had a very flawed one. We wrote a very good constitution for them, which they willingly adopted and have followed very closely since. So that's Japan. And I would argue that we also work to build institutions to avoid what happened after World War I. I think at least the Western democracies really were trying to learn the lessons from World War I, which was retribution frequently leads to the next cycle of violence. And how do you prevent that? By getting people to buy into similar concepts of international law, of international justice. And there was hope at the end of World War II. You all of a sudden saw organizations like the United Nations, World Bank, International Monetary Fund. People hoped, and for years it looked like they would become instruments of a more stable society. Meanwhile, I'll get back to Asia. It wasn't happening at all. You know, the fighting never stopped in Asia. I'm kind of a China hand, Taiwan hand. I spent a lot of time looking at it. And, you know, you immediately after the Japanese surrender had the Civil War, which had been put on hold for 10 years between the Kuomintang, the KMT, and the Chinese Communist Party. Who was going to get to run the biggest, most important country in Asia? No peace there. The other, and frankly, we had no control over that. We had no ability to influence that. We could have shipped in everything we wanted to the KMT. It wouldn't have made any difference. The communists were probably going to win that. At the same time, however, we did make a tragic mistake, and actually it was one of support, not one of us promoting the idea, but one of us supporting the idea of the colonial powers returning to Asia. Guaranteed, and it did, raise huge opposition within the people of Asia. So not only did you have a civil war going on in the most important country in Asia, you also had outbreaks of rebellion against the return of the colonial power, every place from Indonesia to Indochina. It was a recipe for disaster that played out. So there was no peace in Asia. We shouldn't deceive ourselves that the conditions we saw later on, when we went so far as to support the French attempt to basically retake Vietnam, we saw where that led to our eventual unhappy involvement there. So you had this. Those are lessons that we should learn from going forward, but perhaps did not learn enough of. And I will also step back here and say, as a China hand, I've raised this in previous meetings. In the year 2009, I started saying, for the first time, I've never been as worried about China as I am today. Here we are, 2025, I'm saying the same thing. And that means that my level of concern has steadily grown, along with Chinese power, along with, frankly, the rise of Xi Jinping and one-man rule in China. We've touched a little bit on the way the Chinese look at the Second World War, the Zhang, the anti-Japan war. And I will tell you, it's kept alive in China. There is no desire to put it behind. It is a tool of the party's control. We were in China for the 150th anniversary of the Opium War. And every day, in every newspaper, every broadcast, we not only lead off, but spend the bulk of the coverage on a bloody, nasty war of 150 years ago. The beginning, as they put it, of the century of humiliation. Okay, I don't know who you all come from. I'm half Irish. Okay, what did the Irish have? They had 500 years of colonial humiliation. When was the last time you saw Jim Moriarty even raising the Opium War in an Irish context? I not only have done a lot of China and Taiwan, we also served in South Asia for 9 years. You want to talk humiliation? The British consciously destroyed the Bengali textile industry so that they could export more textiles from Lancaster. consciously destroyed it, plunging the richest part of India into poverty. Do you hear Bangladeshis? Do you hear Indians raising that? No. The century of humiliation, the Opium War was bloody, it did horrible things, admittedly. But you had 9 treaty ports where outside powers actually ran the show to some degree. You had 2 or 3 of the major rivers where they could actually go up and trade. You had a customs agency run by foreigners, and for the first time the central government actually receiving money from customs. And you probably had less than 3% of the population that ever saw a foreigner. So that's the century of humiliation. Put it in perspective, why is it so alive in China? It's a tool of the party. And I don't know how you overcome that. I will say that in addition to I'm beginning to sound like I'm hard over, we have to talk. We have to talk. We have to have dialogue. We have to keep in perspective the other side's views. At the same time, anybody who's been here before has heard me say this. One of my favorite quotes comes from Mark Twain. What did he say? He said, "History never repeats itself, but it often rhymes." Look at the world today. Look at what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. Look at the wars in Gaza, but also importantly, look at China saying it has the right to use force against Taiwan whenever it gives up hope for peaceful unification. Building the military to do that. This is way too much like the 1930s for me. And the 1930s did not end well. Aggressive authoritarian powers on the march. But I look at China and I say, okay, this issue, we don't have to go down that sure ending in war. The only way we avoid it, though, is building as effective a deterrent as possible, as quickly as possible, talking to the Chinese about what we're doing, why we're doing, importantly, working with our allies and partners to understand how we collectively can convince China, you don't want to do this. Russia's actually beyond the pale right now. I don't know how you roll back Russia. So you've got these 2 huge powers that are authoritarian. They believe in the rule of war, the rule of the gun. And we have to work together to deter them, to talk to them, to let them know that it's not going to work, and more importantly, that there are other avenues out. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jim. And I know Fig and John also have comments that they're going to respond to that. But before we do, as we're wrapping up the end of our session here, are there questions in the audience? Can we have the lights up? Questions from the audience, and then we'll go to lessons learned, and Fig can respond. Please.
This is for sir. You were discussing some of the differences between the way that the Nuremberg trials for the Nazis were viewed versus kind of how Tokyo trials lack the same gravitas as the Nuremberg trials in some ways. So my question was kind of when you deal with Tokyo, you have themes of East versus West, European, potentially views of European imperialism, or the United States imposing victor's justice for some of the reasons that the Tokyo populace viewed the outcome of those decisions differently. Do you think that those were major factors in shaping attitudes later, or was it just were those kind of themes one of several?
I don't think they were major factors. I think there's something that you naturally look for when you look back on the process. Again, structurally, they were nearly identical. There were some key omissions of consideration, organizations, crimes against humanity, and specific individuals that were all driven by the United States. That is what it is. And not for malicious purposes, but to get to the outcome that best served the United States, and to some degree to protect the colonial powers, to some degree. So that I think was the key factor, and that, I believe, is inarguable. That and when Jim and I are both worried about China, and I'm not so sure that Xi Jinping isn't beyond the pale, already, like Russia. So we share that concern. Could we mea culpa and fess up about the U.S. bias, the U.S. vector on the Far East tribunals? And could Japan be more honest about the imperial Japanese conduct? Yes. Would that influence Chinese thinking or propaganda? Almost certainly not, but it might reduce the resonance of that propaganda, and I'd still like to see it.
So just a segue on that, keep going. So why haven't the Japanese apologized? I mean,
We didn't make them. Both sides moved on. And it's not something to damn either side for, I think, Steve. It's just something that happened. The vector to maintain stability in Japan, retain the emperor for very, very practical reasons, and to build a modern Japan that would become a U.S. ally meant that, along with, remember, I talked about the shock of the atomic bombings, which put a different victimhood on it for the Japanese, and the absence of spaces and faces where the Japanese population had to look the atrocities of Imperial Japan in the eye. And absent all those things that were present in Nazi Germany, the outcome was denial. And again, I'm not damning, I'm observing.
Well, sorry, Jim. It's been 80 years now, more than 80 years. Almost all the people who fought in World War II are dead. And you've got politicians now who weren't even alive. To me, it'd be brilliant for the current prime minister, who is, a female.
A conservative female.
Well, I know she's with the LDP and she was put up, I get that. But what an opportunity for Japan to, it doesn't have to be by her, but it would be very poignant.
I couldn't agree more, but I think, all politics are local, to rely on cliche. And in the vibrant democracy that we helped facilitate in Japan, that's not getting you reelected. Sorry. And the 80 years matters not. I mean, the last time I got shot at a lot was in a neighborhood spat that started in the 14th century. People don't forget.
And by the way, Fig, I love hearing your comments, but you're not a lawyer. All respect, but so Rich Frank, if you can hear, I'd love to hear your thoughts here.
A couple of observations about this. I've come to think, based on the work I've done, that there was a direct connection between MacArthur's decision in January 1946 to get the emperor out of being tried at the Tokyo War Crimes trial. And this was directly connected to his concern about the possibility of mass famine and instability in Japan. And that was motivated. To me, the chronological coincidence of these two factors coming together at the same time and the decision that MacArthur made is very powerful, that's what he thought. And I've come to think that that was a reasonable decision for him to make at the time. And the other factor that was clearly in the background here was that MacArthur and his military secretary, Bonner Fellers, had thought about how they were going to conduct the occupation and the transformation of Japan before they got there. And as they viewed the situation, the huge issue that they faced was that they were occupying a Japan that had been totally dominated and controlled by what people we call the militarists. And what they believed was that the only way that they could break the power, the only thing they could employ or deploy to break the power of the militarists was to mobilize the emperor as that, basically that wedge that was going to, in fact, that's what they called the wedge theory, that was going to break the bond and the control of the militarists over the Japanese population. So that was going on in the background. And as I look at it now, I don't think the initial decision to retain Hirohito in the first year or two of the occupation was ill-considered or not probably necessary at that time. The great mistake was, in my view, that after we got through that tumultuous and dangerous period where there was really serious danger of a breakdown of civil order, of famine, and all these other potential catastrophes, after that was over, then it was time to at least have Hirohito resign and take war responsibility. And to me, that would have gone a long way towards dealing with the problems we have today, which very much, as the other speakers have talked about, is very much alive and well, and not just in China, in Indonesia, in Vietnam. I can go down the list again and again and again, where these people have not forgotten what happened between 1937 and 1945. That was the full span of the Asia-Pacific War. And all the horrific things Japan did were caused to be done because most of the people who died in the Asia-Pacific War died of starvation and disease. They were not killed by explicit atrocities.
Lauren?
Jim, you talked a little bit about going forward, looking at what to do about China. You talked about deterrence, and we talked a little bit about some of the institutions that were in place or the actions that were taken after World War II, and particularly in Japan. Food aid, medical aid, putting in place systems to resolve disputes. Well, Steve mentioned that most of the people who went through this and might remember it aren't alive anymore. And the institutions that were set up after World War II are strained or failing. We're not doing, not just the United States, but others are cutting their food aid, their development aid. We haven't fought a trade war in a very, very long time. Certainly we stopped having shoot 'em up, bang, bang ones, but our trade institutions are not able to handle trade disputes anymore. So looking forward, it's one thing to deter and stop a war, but the conflicts and the problems still exist. There are still maybe some common interests we would be best to address together. So is there a way to build institutions and attitudes? For example, after World War II, we decided it wasn't okay to have mass atrocities anymore. That used to be the norm after wars, just kill everybody. But we decided it wasn't the norm anymore. So I'm looking now, what did we learn from not just the deterrence piece, but the part of it, but also to maintain and build peace? What would we need to be doing now that we should be learning lessons from what happened after World War II and the defeat of Japan?
Which one would like to take the lead on that? Jim? You better be careful what you say, you know.
Okay, guilty as charged. The problem right now is you have the world pulling in all sorts of different directions. And the question is, do we allow it to continue to be pulled in those directions? I've worked at very senior levels trying to grasp this, but I'm now going to go down to the micro and say that if you look at it, some of this stuff can make you feel, I guess the word is disenfranchised or powerless. And yet we're not. We're all sort of individual atoms, but we're atoms that are deciding our own direction. We decide here in America who we vote for. We decide what issues are important to us. We decide how we grow up, how we mature, who we connect with. Hawaii is really neat in that it does have these tremendous ties with Japan. And I'm going to emphasize how strange that is for somebody coming from the state of Massachusetts originally, to have cousins and nephews and folks who just kind of say, well, I'm graduating high school next year, thinking of going over to Japan for a year and maybe teaching some. That is unique, and it's a huge, huge asset. I would argue that those people coming out and kind of saying, well, maybe I'll go to Japan for a year, or maybe I'll go straight into college or whatever, they're a resource. Encourage them, build them. I started talking about dialogue a little bit. And I do think that one of the things that can be done by anybody is to reach out, to be part of an organization that says, okay, whether it's Rotary or whatever, how do I connect with people overseas? How do I stay connected? How do I let them know what's on my mind? How do I figure out what is on their minds? It's, Lauren and I had unusual careers in that we shifted countries every 2 or 3 years. But to plop down in a new place and to try to truly understand it rather than just hanging out with the Americans that you might meet. They're important too. But you got to try and reach out to that great, big, wonderful, confusing world out there. The more you do it, the better the chance is. How do we get the leaders to talk to each other amicably? How do we deal with not only China, but FIG does a lot of work on North Korea. And boy, that's an important and tough task. And the question is, how do you do that effectively? How do you push people? How do you learn? How do you... obviously here I am, 72 years old, and we haven't solved all the problems of the world yet. And I'm sitting up here being a nattering nabob of negativism, warning that things are getting horrible. Well, this is like the 1930s. Well, anybody under 72, okay, I'll make it under 70. Go out there and prove me wrong. Go out there and make those connections, and go out there and show that there's a different direction. You had that Swedish activist on Thornburg, the activist on climate control. She achieved a lot. She raised the issue. Maybe people should be raising the issue of, why are we talking about nuclear weapons again? How do we work? How do we tell everybody to sit down at the table? And by the way, here's one where the Chinese absolutely refuse to talk to anybody about nuclear weapons. But how do you embarrass them enough? How do you get enough demand? You could actually get that fairly easily here, and you could probably get it in Russia. But how do you begin talking to the folks, saying this is an issue that anybody under 70 really needs to address? I'll stop there.
Hello. As your elder,
Don't say more handsome.
well, that's obvious. But I'd just like to hit on what he said, what can you do? And relationships are always the key. When I talk to China about whether or not we should have military-to-military contact, apparently they're going to establish a hotline, but too often in interactions between nations, the relationships become bargaining chips. And when things go sour, well, we're not going to talk to you anymore. That makes me so mad. I was going to use another term. Relationships are the table, they're not the chips, right? And if you don't have that, so however you can do what Jim suggested and build relationships and build connections, it can hurt. You may not change the world, but then again, you might. Sorry.
I think we have one more question from the gentleman.
Good afternoon. Thank you guys very much. This has been very inspiring and enlightening. I'm a retired colonel from the Air Force. I'm a member of a world peace organization called the Soka Gakkai out of Japan. And I've been a member for 50 years now. And I went to school in Massachusetts. And so I just came off of an 8-week tour throughout Asia on a world peace tour. And when I saw the title of this, The Journey for Peace, I look at what we do from here forward, not just focusing on what happened and what went on in the past. When I arrived on this journey that I went on, I actually arrived in Japan on the 80th anniversary of the dropping of the atomic bomb. I went to Nagasaki for their memorial, and when I ended my tour, it was on the Independence Day of Vietnam, and I was in Vietnam. These type of things is what I find journey meaning, and I want to ask you, as you talk about, because I loved your question, and I think it really has to be more of our younger people, the people that haven't been born during this time, and how do we create the mindset for peace? How do we create it from our own standpoint of where we are in our lives? So often we tend to dwell on what happened as opposed to where and what we can do now. And our young people have to have a mindset of hope, a mindset of focusing forward, and as you said, traveling the world and making a difference in your genre. How does this panel, and how do you see that, and how does Journey for Peace fit into our forward moving as opposed to reflecting on what happened?
Thank you so much for your question. As we wrap up our panelists, perhaps you could give us some closing comments and in addressing this as well as the next steps.
There's not an easy answer. I think the truth is to get serious about peace instead of having it on one hand be throwing flowers in the air and wearing a Grateful Dead shirt or something, or on the other hand being we're going to kick your butt all over the world. Okay, so I applaud President Trump's assertions that he's the peacemaking president. I'm not going to evaluate that because that won't help, but we should be peacemakers. With regard to North Korea, for example, one of the things I say is that we have to reimagine our role. For 70 plus years, we've seen ourselves on the peninsula as war preventers, focused only on deterrence, and we've made no effort to get no serious effort to prioritize a permanent end to the state of conflict. Okay? I think that's a problem. We need to see ourselves as peacemakers and then recognize that peace is hard work. I've done war, I've done peace. Peace is a lot more difficult. So it's a mindset, and it isn't, I'm not a, angst-ridden old warrior about it. I did what I did, do it again, but conflict should not be the first option, it should be the last. And once you've done it, you should seek a meaningful outcome that provides a better future. And you should work your ass off at it. So mindset would be the word I'd give you.
I am on. I just am stalling for time while I think of what to say. Okay, you have a lot of things going for you here in Hawaii. A lot of initiatives are being undertaken. A lot of initiatives with school children, which I find really, really encouraging. And I saw nothing like it growing up in a small mill town in Massachusetts. At some point, you would hope that all these initiatives get together and kind of coordinate the way forward. I would love to see folks who, I'm not going to talk about other organizations, but I am going to talk about other organizations. Pacific Asian Affairs Council has been in the schools for years. They're effective at getting that initial buy-in from people, getting them interested. You have this organization, which is pointing out the urgency of making that whole thing work, of figuring out how you get people who start looking at the world when they're 10, 12, 13, maybe go to Japan, Vietnam, or maybe even Taiwan when they're 18 or 17. Then go off to university or stay here and do a job working for a representative who's working on security issues or what do we call that? Sister state, sister city relationships, then go on in whatever path they want, but something that keeps them involved in looking outward and having a voice that's an informed voice, using that voice to try and influence. I think if you get enough people doing that, it does have an impact. It has an impact here, but it also has an impact on those you're going to be working with going forward. And I mean not just the Americans, but the foreigners who get to know that we folk from Hawaii, and I'm going to switch from my Massachusetts hat to my Hawaii hat and say, we understand the importance of Ohana, and the biggest Ohana is the 7+ billion people who live on Earth, and we've got to figure out a way to work together.
Thank you, Jim. Before I go to Rich, I'm going to make a little plug for the Peace Corps. As a former Peace Corps volunteer, if you want to get to know people and understand them, and hopefully they understand you, there's no better way. Okay. Rich, do you have any final comments, thoughts?
Let me just say this. I don't think seeking peace is going to be achieved if we only think from this point forward. I think you have to have some context to deal with not only who you're immediately dealing with, but the entire context of all the other people involved. Certainly this is what impressed me overwhelmingly in the work I've done in dealing with people and historians from all over Asia, and really understanding their perspective on the Asia-Pacific War, and Japan's war across that, until you really, I think, have a full comprehension of what they experienced. And the thing that has enormously impressed me is that this is not ancient history in a lot of these places, not by any means. I casually run into people at World War II Museum in New Orleans. I'm talking to some other people, and this woman comes up from Malaysia and starts talking about the family experiences or whatever. It hasn't been forgotten, and you have to have that. You have to consider that context. You can work for peace, but you can't forget the past.
Thank you so much. Yes, poignant. And John, go ahead. I would like to hear you.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. So, as an adjunct for political science and international relations, it's telling that international relations grew out of history, study of history. 20th century threw us into, well, there's more than just history. There's behavioralism, human nature, things that you have to bring into history. But to echo Rich's point, and the ambassador's favorite quote, you cannot forget the history. And so the impetus of this program was to educate to particularly high school and college type folks who geographically or chronologically, the Second World War was to them as the Spanish-American War is to me. And I can tell you I don't know enough about Spanish-American War. And so, and to Rich's point, the effects of this catastrophe, worst in the history of humanity, are still playing out, as we talked about in some detail tonight. So to educate young folks to understand why things are the way they are, when you go downrange, you go armed with, this is, the fellow or gal I'm going to talk to probably lost some family members 80 years ago. And so that's the impetus of this program. Educate, look at history, understand why, and then most importantly, because history it does rhyme, what were the red flags back then? And are they emerging now? I think we've made that point pretty well. And it's, in some of these things, you have to go back, 4 centuries, as Fig mentioned. But more contemporarily, 20th century things that you have to at least have a working knowledge of if you're going to be an ambassador of peace going forward. You have to know the history, and then more importantly, you have to know the why and what emerged, what was the logic here, and as bizarre and irrational as the outcome was, there's a train of this logic that's worth remembering. Should we wrap it up? Okay, were there any other questions? I thought I saw somebody that wanted to. There was one? Oh. Yeah, we don't have to get out of here until they throw us out. And I don't think it's going to happen until 1500, so we're good.
Okay, sorry. First, I'm sorry I'm completely underdressed this session. Gym shorts and a t-shirt's not a good look. But definitely wanted to be here, even if it was in shorts, and my coffee hasn't kicked in, so I'm a little sluggish right now. But really appreciate everything. I've learned a lot, learned about a lot of history. And I'm sorry I have to inject this question, but something I've learned at the academy, something that I've learned in every job I've had, in high school, middle school, everything. Something I've learned is, it's very important to learn history. Because, in order to make future decisions, we got to learn what our foundation we stand on. But, something else that, as I've listened and I've watched you guys talk, paying attention to the present. As leaders, as young people, I just turned 20. I'm still figuring things out. I'm not in a position where I can make big decisions. I'm still in the phase of learning from my leaders, learning from others, and being ready to get into that position where I will end up making these decisions. But my question is a big part is paying attention to history. So as young leaders learning from World War II and these events, what is your guys' recommendation on what we should pay closest attention to in watching how today's leaders navigate global conflict and peace building? So just what have you guys seen, and what should we young leaders start paying attention to, assuming we do have that motivation to learn? But we see a lot of news, tickety talks, Instagram reels. We see a lot of today's leaders working. What should we closely pay attention to?
Oh, that's an easy one. Outcomes. Pay attention to outcomes. Get past TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, opinionating. You can take it in, but what really happens, and make a point to, as objectively as possible, find out what happens. I'm going to plug a news source called Ground News. Does anybody use that? Because they tell you which side of the left-right spectrum a story's coming from, and I wouldn't say it's wholly objective, but it's somewhat scientific. And it gives you a sense of what you're looking at, and if you pay, I'm not endorsed by them or paid by them, but they will show you some of your blind spots. So, outcomes objectively.
Does anyone else have any comments? Jim, you have something?
First of all, learn how to turn on your microphone. Secondly, biggest thing you can do is listen to people closely. And I think Fig nailed it on news. There's so much out there right now, and we all love to hear people who say the things we think. So make sure that on any issue that is controversial, you're not just going down the rabbit hole and hearing what you want to hear. So, it's, in a way, you can Google things and find things out that are absolutely fascinating, and then you always got to think, as people say, where the heck is this coming from? How reliable is it? And then, you got an exciting time ahead of you. There's going to be a lot of stuff going on. I heard somebody say that recently that starting off, it's good to be a little bit of a generalist, and then you turn into a specialist. That basically, I don't know what that means in terms of your next assignments or anything like that, but keep your eyes open, Don't be afraid of going into areas that you haven't been in before, because that's going to be where you're going to learn perspective.
Well, just, I'm not sure, Rich, if you had any comments on that or not, and if you don't, then we're going to move into the closing and recognize a few people. Rich, did you have anything you wanted to add to that question, answer?
I would just endorse again, it's extremely important, particularly in this day and age where people rely so much on the internet for information, to realize that most websites, they have their algorithms, and they either restrict what they show you or whatever here. It's very important to try to read a spectrum of perspectives to, work out where we really are. I can't emphasize enough, it seems to me, that if you simply only go to things that make you feel comfortable, you're not being well informed. So that's my 2 cents.
And Karen, before we go to the closing, may I add a quote that I've read in the past from Daisaku Ikeda, who wrote The New Human Revolution. He was the last president of Soka Gakkai. All people essentially desire peace. It is not flowery rhetoric or pretense that draws forth that inner spirit from people's lives, but only open, honest dialogue coming from genuine, sincere humanity. And in Hawaii, we call that aloha.
Thank you. That's lovely. We do have one more person we're going to call up, and just let me confer with John for just one moment. Dennis Drake, please come forward. You've been a partner in this and doing this, and he's with representing Rotary International today. Thank you, Dennis.
Thanks. I'm the president of the Pearl Harbor Rotary Club, and our club is really excited to have been a sponsor of this organization for the last 2 years. As a matter of fact, the person that came up with this whole idea is a member of our club, and get that Skill Messler in the audience. A lot of people don't know much about Rotary. It's pretty amazing. Rotary, we are one of 48 clubs here in Hawaii. There are 35,000 clubs worldwide in 220 countries. There are 12 million Rotarians around the world. And one of the most common purposes of Rotary is to seek peace. And so it's a natural connection for us to be able to sponsor this, and we're really proud of it. And to the Colonel's point about where we go from here, it's not an accident that our 2 scouts over here have been the opening and closing of this program, because when we put Journey to Peace together, the goal, and we haven't reached it yet, we're now a year and a half into this. This is our 7th seminar. But the goal and the vision was to have this entire room filled with young people, high school students, college kids, young professionals. We're not there yet by any means, but that's where we're going, because this is a young man's game or a young person's game. We're all near the end at some point, right? The future are these guys over here, and so that's really where we want to go. I just want to thank the panel. As a matter of fact, here's a former president of the Honolulu Rotary Club. So awesome job, guys. And our sponsors, we mentioned them before, East-West Center, the West Point Alumni Association, the museum for the great work they do, and Scout Troop 97 from Pearl Harbor, who have, in past seminars and this one, been here with the Scouts to help with the logistics. So thank you all, and thank you all for being here. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to our Scouts.
Thank you very much, everybody. We want to reiterate the disclaimer. JPI is an unincorporated group of individuals. The views expressed today are those of the speakers and do not reflect any official organization. Mahalo for joining us on this journey to peace. Stay tuned for future sessions.
This concludes the event. Mahalo for coming. Thank you.